Skoll.
Not only are conflicts becoming more frequent, but also more crowded, with over 50% of conflict states facing at least 2 or more armed conflicts simultaneously in a given year. And to complicate the security landscape even further, a growing number of these conflicts are becoming what is called internationalized, meaning that external state and even non-state actors are intervening in these conflicts, even when initially highly localized intrastate conflicts. Now, as a conflict scholar, my primary area of research is on external intervention in intrastate conflicts or civil conflicts. I know that's a mouthful. It makes me very popular at parties. But really what that means is I study why do some civil conflicts receive interventions and others don't. And when they do receive an intervention, what is the effect of that intervention on conflict outcomes? Now, the research, the academic scholarship on external intervention in civil conflicts does not always paint an optimistic picture. External intervention can increase conflict duration, conflict severity. It can complicate bargaining by adding new veto players, and it can also reduce the likelihood of a negotiated settlement. And yet, there is also a humanitarian question when we think about external intervention in civil conflicts. What is our responsibility to protect, especially when we consider the atrocious consequences of war? And what are our consequences of inaction when conflicts fly under the radar and go unnoticed and remain invisible to the rest of the world? To intervene or to not intervene? That is the question, and it's not only an abstract question. It's one that we are facing again and again as the world becomes more interconnected, conflicts more frequent, and conflict actors more crowded. And these decisions on whether or not we intervene or not intervene can have enormous consequences on the future state of the world. Which actors rise to the top, how long conflicts last, all of these decisions can be determined by which conflicts receive our attention and which ones don't. And in a world in which we have limited resources and countless issues competing for our attention, these decisions are increasingly becoming more and more complicated. So my research starts with a simple question, but it has enormous policy implications. Why and what explains the variation in the type and level of interventions that we see in civil conflicts around the world? Now, in order to understand the effectiveness of interventions, we have to first understand why they are given in the first place. This is what we call in academia a selection problem. Really what that means is that intervention is not random. It's not as if external actors are picking conflict names out of a hat in some sort of experimental vibe where they're trying to decide which conflicts receive interventions and which ones don't, which can complicate our decision as scholars because it's very difficult to disentangle the motivations and strategic incentives for why states might intervene from their subsequent effects of those foreign policy decision-making. So in answering this question, I take a look at hundreds of conflict dyad episodes over several decades. And what I find is that intervention, it's not just a simple yes-no decision. It's not just whether the world intervenes, but how and why. A state has a number of different policy options in its foreign policy toolkit. They could provide, for example, military support in the form of troops and weapons, either to the rebel group or to the government. They could impose sanctions on a conflict state. They could provide mediation assistance or even foreign aid. And there's even strategic trade-offs between some of these different foreign policy options. Some states might even choose several of these simultaneously, or perhaps none at all. And so again, the question here is not just whether there's an intervention, but why do we see certain types of intervention in certain contexts? And what my research finds is that rebel group branding, or the overarching story a rebel group tells about itself and why it fights, strongly shapes the type and level of intervention that they receive. Rebel group branding, it's not just a slick logo. It's an overarching identity, often rooted in grievances, most commonly religious, ethnic, or ideological in nature, in contrast to groups that don't have some sort of overarching identity. And why this is important is this brand or this overarching identity can be utilized by external actors as a heuristic or a shortcut for making intervention decisions, particularly when they're trying to make fast judgments or quick judgments in highly messy situations. And if we use branding as an analogy taken from the business world, we can see how rebel groups might vary among the following 3 dimensions. Number 1, their level of brand awareness. Does their story, is that recognizable to the worldwide population? Number 2, the level of brand loyalty. Is it a story that individuals or external actors resonate with? And number 3, what's called anti-brand behavior. Strong brands might prompt external intervention and support, but also potentially fierce opposition in response to that narrative. In business world, a strong brand would sell more. In the conflict world, a strong brand theoretically drives in more outsiders on both sides of the conflict. Therefore, calling a conflict ethnic or religious might not just be a description, it can also be an activation. Words matter, and the way that we talk and discuss and describe conflicts can have enormous impacts on mobilizing diasporas, unlocking funding streams, shaping public media coverage, and even justifying military coalitions. In other words, perception is not peripheral, it's powerful. Take, for example, the conflicts in Syria and Yemen, which initially begun from a myriad of localized grievances and internal dynamics. But once these conflicts were framed as religious wars, we saw support pouring in from co-religious groups abroad, as well as counter-interventions from rivals. And so this story wasn't just a story, it became a magnet for different types of support. Particularly today, in a world where we are seeing the number of non-state actors and non-state armed groups multiplying, particularly in a digital media age where these groups can gain international attention overnight, the potential for these groups to shape global narratives and to even legitimize themselves has never been greater. And so therefore, understanding how perception drives intervention is not just an important question, but one that's increasingly becoming urgent. Because if visibility and perception matter now more than ever, the question is what stories rise to the top. And when I look at my data, I see that several trends emerge, and not all rebel group stories attract the same level of attention. For starters, rebel groups that have a religious brand are far more likely to attract troops and weapons, both on behalf of the rebel groups as well as the government. So you're more likely to see a more intense reaction in conflicts where the rebel groups are framed in religious terms. Religion is widespread. It can inspire intense loyalty, but also opposition. Interestingly, ethnic brands have a different effect. While ethnic brands do prompt international attention, and the world does seem to notice, the tools that get utilized are different. My data suggests that rebel groups with an ethnic brand are far more likely to attract things like mediation assistance and sanctions, which might signal that international actors are paying attention, but maybe want to keep a safer distance. Thirdly, when we talk about leftist or communist brands, well, once very polarizing during the heart of the Cold War, these brands have decreased in their saliency in recent years, showing some evidence here that maybe different brands have different strategic incentives to adopt depending on varying geopolitical dynamics that are occurring in the world. And interestingly, for me, I find that rebel groups that don't have a brand, that don't have some sort of overarching religious, ethnic, or ideological narrative that's being cast, they are the least likely to receive all forms of intervention: troops, weapons, sanctions, mediation assistance, foreign aid. These are the groups that fly under the radar, remain relatively invisible to the rest of the world. And what this tells me here is that there are some very real strategic incentives as well as trade-offs when it comes to branding decisions. On the one hand, branding might increase international legitimacy, attention, and awareness. It might draw in external funding or support. On the other hand, though, it might also attract enemies, and it might also limit your internal cohesion or agency within the localized dynamic of a conflict. And while groups might intentionally not engage in branding decisions for those exact reasons, what my data suggests is when they do so, they are relatively invisible to the rest of the world. Now, this also remains to be seen, particularly in the 21st century in a digital age. To what extent do rebel groups have exclusive control over the narratives that are being cast? Do they have exclusive control over their branding decisions, or can outside groups do that branding for them? This, I think, is a very interesting area of future research that is yet to be explored. While we might see that some groups intentionally engage in branding decisions for very strategic reasons, other groups that don't do that might still have their conflict narrative maybe take on a life of its own as external actors can see something familiar or something that they resonate with and want to use that for their own strategic purposes. My data sheds light on also this other increasingly interesting puzzle of why we see, particularly in the last few decades, so many conflicts fall along religious and ethnic lines. This is a puzzle I talk about with my civil conflict students every year. And it's not necessarily the case that religion and ethnicity are inherently conflict prone, but that they might just be powerful mobilizers. And that once a conflict does get off the ground, they're more likely to be sustained when they have this narrative that resonates with people around the world. And so this, I think, is a very interesting puzzle as we think of true causes of conflicts and the instrumental value that some of these narratives might have and what that means for the future of conflict. Because as long as actors see maybe the strategic incentives of adopting identity-based narratives, we might see religion and ethnicity play an increasingly visible role in conflicts around the world. And if those strategic incentives remain, then we're unlikely to see those trends fade. Now, I want to pause right here and to remind us all here that behind every conflict data set and every conflict narrative are people. People whose lives depend on how the world labels their war. As a conflict scholar, I have a deep appreciation for how complex, nuanced, and complicated conflicts can be. There are often a myriad of different motivations and grievances driving conflicts, some very well justified and even altruistic, others, unfortunately, a bit more opportunistic or even nefarious. There are real people on the ground making very tough decisions in the midst of fear, violence, uncertainty, poverty, chaos, desperation. There are people who are just trying to make ends meet or just trying to protect their families. There are people who are just trying to find a sense of agency or dignity in the midst of chaos. Identities don't always neatly align. Many individuals have cross-cutting identities that challenge their loyalties and complicate alignment decisions. And so my fear in all of this is that we oversimplify and reduce conflicts to a simple story. And as a result, only some conflicts make it into our attention and others do not. Simplifying a conflict might make it easier to talk about, but in fact, it makes it much more difficult to resolve. Simplified narratives flatten nuance, they obscure local realities, they make it much more difficult for policymakers and mediators to understand the true drivers of violence. And when simplified stories attract outsized attention or even external intervention, this can complicate bargaining and perhaps even harden some of these divisions rather than heal them. And so while we can't rip branding out of the war, there might be strategic incentives that we have no control over, but we can become wiser consumers of conflict stories. Public opinion can shape foreign policy decisions that are made by policymakers, but we know that public opinion is not always organic. It can be influenced or even engineered. The stories that reach us are often the ones that are most easily packaged, repeated, and shared. And so what we watch, what we read, what we choose to pay attention to, what we allow to fade into silence, sends signals about who is deserving of help and who is not. And In particular, if branding has taught us anything, is that perception is power. But with power also comes responsibility to look closer, to challenge some of these simplified narratives, and to resist the urge of wanting to sort conflicts into neat categories. My research also shows that even when we consider this selection effect of intervention, that different intervention tools have varying as well as significant effects on conflict outcomes. And so it is important for us to recognize, what impact these varying tools might have on the conflicts that we are looking out at in the world. As a result, our responsibility to protect not only requires good intentions, but also good information. Now, this is where I come in as a conflict scholar and those with me who are seeking to understand the empirical evidence to say, what do we know about past conflicts? How do they shape our understanding of how interventions might work in future conflicts? But that being said, policymakers can't really make the best policy decisions if the public also doesn't understand the strategic trade-offs and the stakes. Because at the end of the day, these decisions really do have enormous consequences, and our attention or inattention can become its own form of foreign policy. At the end of the day, and I'll wrap up here, is that we have a hard truth to reconcile. There are no simple stories and no simple solutions. And that's something that's really hard to wrestle with. This is something I wrestle with my students on almost a daily basis. We often have to resist the urge to tidy up things that are confusing into things that are comforting, and to wrestle and really seek to understand complexity and truth. And true understanding ultimately leads to humility, which is another thing that I talk about with my students. This idea that we don't always have the right answers, and there is still a lot we don't know about the world and so much more to learn. But with true intellectual humility can also drive wisdom, which is the ability to make difficult decisions in a thoughtful way, even when there is uncertainty or we don't have all the answers. The ability to act with care, even when the solution is not obviously clear. And while these are values that I seek to instill upon my students as a civil conflict scholar who teaches in the security studies discipline, these are values that I think we can all benefit from as we really wrestle with some of the most challenging and confusing conflicts of our day. And I think that if we can do so and embrace those values of curiosity, wisdom, and humility, then I think we can pursue strategies that do more healing than harm. Thank you.